The galaxy was on the brink of disaster. Solara, a once mighty star that had lit the way for countless civilizations, was dying, and it was taking everything with it. The radiation storms caused by its collapse were devastating entire worlds, turning thriving systems into barren wastelands. The pulse of the star was growing erratic, sending shockwaves of energy and destabilizing the fragile balance of the galactic sector. If Solara went supernova, it would obliterate everything within 1,000 light years. Entire empires, trillions of lives, gone in an instant. The Galactic Council, made up of the galaxy's most powerful and influential species, had long debated the situation. Nothing could be done. A dying star was simply beyond saving, or so they thought. Then came humanity. The Council had dismissed them at first. What could a single species, new to the galactic stage, possibly offer in the face of such cosmic devastation? But humanity had an undeniable trait: persistence. A group of brilliant scientists, led by the visionary Dr. Evelyn Hayes, had proposed an audacious plan to stabilize the star, something never attempted before. But it wasn't just a plan. It was a miracle, or so it seemed. The Phoenix Initiative was born, a joint effort between Earth's finest engineers, scientists, and soldiers. The initiative aimed to repair the dying star itself. Under the leadership of Captain Alyssa Carter, a decorated hero and tactician, the team would deploy energy conduits into Solara's collapsing core and redirect its failing energy flow. It was an insane mission, one that had no precedent, but humanity had never been a species to back down from the impossible. They would either save the star or die trying. But the risks were monumental. To even approach Solara, the team would have to navigate through the star's chaotic atmosphere, a place where radiation storms tore apart everything in their path. The fleet would be vulnerable from the moment they entered the outer atmosphere. No one could predict what would happen next. Captain Carter stood on the command deck of the Spearhead, the flagship of the Phoenix Initiative's fleet. The massive ship's exterior gleamed with the latest human technology, every inch of its design dedicated to making it the perfect tool for this impossible mission. Carter wasn't nervous. She had faced death more times than she could count. What she feared was failure. Failure would mean the end for billions. Humanity had made its choice. It had come to this: repair the star or watch everything burn. "We're approaching the outer boundaries of Solara's atmosphere," reported Lieutenant Marcus Lee, the lead engineer and one of the initiative's finest minds. His eyes were locked on the star's dying light, a fierce, shifting orange glow. "Radiation levels are rising. We'll need to deploy the shields immediately." "Understood," Carter replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "Initiate the sequence and keep the fleet in formation. No one gets left behind." The crew worked with a synchronized rhythm, their actions precise. Humanity's finest minds and bravest souls had come together for one goal: survival. As the Spearhead and its fleet surged toward the heart of Solara, Alyssa Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this would be a defining moment for her species. Out in the vast reaches of space, the rival factions of the galaxy, those who saw humanity's growing influence as a threat, watched from the shadows. They had already begun plotting. Some believed humanity's mission would fail, but there were others who were less certain. If the Phoenix Initiative succeeded, it would change the course of galactic history. But if they failed, the ripple effect would be devastating for all life in the sector. The race against time had begun. In the shadow of the dying star, humanity's greatest trial was just beginning. And for the first time, their fate, and the fate of the galaxy, was in their hands. The Phoenix Initiative fleet plunged deeper into the chaotic heart of Solara's dying corona, its hulls groaning under the intense gravitational pull of the collapsing star. The closer they got, the more unstable the surrounding space became. Radiation storms, once sporadic, now lashed out like beasts, pummeling their shields with unbearable force. The shields flickered briefly, then surged back to full power, humming with the effort of keeping the fleet intact. Captain Alyssa Carter stood at the helm of the spearhead, her jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the swirling maelstrom ahead. The turbulence outside their ship was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The radiation was so intense that it bent light itself, casting the star's outer layers in an eerie, shifting hue. The storm outside was just a precursor. Beyond it lay Solara's core, a swirling ball of unstable energy that threatened to tear them apart the moment they entered. "Shields holding at 78%, reported Lieutenant Marcus Lee, his voice tight with concentration as his fingers danced over the console. "But we can't maintain this for long. The radiation storms are getting worse." "Keep pushing forward," Carter ordered. "We've got no choice. If we don't make it past this barrier, the mission's over." She could feel the tension in the air. The crew knew how critical this moment was. This was their one shot. If the fleet couldn't reach the star's core and deploy the energy conduits, everything humanity had worked for would be lost. They would be forced to retreat, leaving the galaxy to watch as Solara's final, cataclysmic death sent ripples of destruction across the cosmos. Suddenly, a warning light blinked on Lee's console, followed by an alarm. "Captain, we've got incoming ships, enemy forces, at least 20 of them. They're coming out of the radiation storms." Carter's eyes narrowed. They hadn't anticipated the enemy attacking so soon. Rival factions, sensing the potential power shift if humanity succeeded, had been tracking their movements from the shadows. Now, they had decided to strike before the Phoenix Initiative could deploy the star-stabilizing conduits. "Shields up. All ships prepare for combat," Carter barked. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Prepare to engage the enemy." "Captain," Lieutenant Zara Rios, the ship's weapons officer, called out. "I'm detecting a new ship class among them. It's huge, likely a battleship. If they're after us, they'll try to take us down before we can reach the core. Then we'll make sure they don't have that chance. Rios, target their engines. Lee, we need to move faster. Get us into the center of the storm." The spearhead lurched forward, the engines roaring as the ship pushed itself deeper into the turbulent energy field. The incoming enemy fleet, a mix of sleek, heavily armed warships, dived straight into the storm after them, their cannons unleashing a barrage of plasma fire. "Enemy fire inbound," Rios shouted as she launched a salvo of return fire, the ship rocking as it struck one of the pursuing vessels. "Direct hit. They're not going down without a fight." Carter gritted her teeth as the ship shook under the blast. The spearhead was built for battles like this, but even its reinforced hull had its limits. The shields, already strained by the radiation, struggled to keep up with the incoming fire. "Captain," Lee said through clenched teeth, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled with the ship's controls. "We're going to be caught in the gravity well of the star if we don't get out of here. It's pulling us in faster." "I know," Carter replied, her voice cold but determined. "We'll keep them off our backs for as long as we can. Then we make a run for the core." With a final decisive order, Carter led the charge, pushing the spearhead deeper into Solara's heart. The enemy fleet continued to pursue, but the star's radiation storms were beginning to tear apart their formations, throwing them off course. As the spearhead darted and weaved through the cosmic chaos, Carter saw a brief flicker of hope. If they could just make it a little further, they could lose the enemy in the storm. But as they reached the outer edge of the star's core, a massive shockwave from the star's death throes ripped through the space around them. The spearhead shuddered violently as it was thrown into a spin. The lights on the ship flickered, and the main console sparked with the strain. They had entered the worst part of the storm. "Hold on," Carter shouted, gripping the armrest as the crew scrambled to stabilize the ship. The battle, the star's collapse, the storm, all of it merged into one massive struggle. They were on the edge of oblivion, surrounded by enemies and the furious wrath of a dying sun. And yet, in that moment, humanity's resolve burned brighter than ever. The spearhead groaned as it fought against the violent turbulence, the entire ship shaking violently with each passing shockwave from Solara's dying heart. The star's core was an unpredictable maelstrom, radiating with intense waves of plasma and gravitational forces that bent the fabric of space itself. For every inch they moved forward, it felt as though the ship was being torn apart. The enemy fleet, though damaged by the radiation storms, had not given up. They continued to close in, relentless in their pursuit. "Engines are at 40% power," Lieutenant Lee shouted, sweat dripping from his forehead as his hands worked feverishly over the controls. "We're not going to make it at this rate, Captain." "Push harder," Carter ordered, her voice as steel-like as her gaze. "We're almost there. We need to get close enough to deploy the conduits." The mission was simple in theory. Get close to the heart of Solara, drill into its unstable core, and insert the energy-stabilizing conduits. These conduits were designed to siphon off the excess energy from the star's death throes, redirecting it into a controlled burst that would stabilize the core long enough for it to burn out safely. It was an impossible task, one that no species had ever attempted, but humanity's engineers were confident. They had designed the technology, tested it, and now they had to make it work. Carter glanced at the view from the command deck. The dying star was a swirl of fire and chaos, its edges shifting and pulsating with each passing moment. It was as though Solara was alive, breathing its last breaths, a living entity trying to take everything down with it. "Enemy fleet closing in on R6, Rios reported, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "They're preparing to launch a full barrage." "I know," Carter said, eyes narrowing. "We've got to make this work. Rios, target their ship's weapons. Lee, prepare to initiate the deployment sequence the moment we hit the core." The tension was palpable. The spearhead darted and weaved between plasma bursts, narrowly avoiding enemy fire. The enemy ships were more agile, but the spearhead was stronger, built for the impossible. Still, the more they pressed forward, the more perilous the journey became. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the ship. A barrage of plasma fire had breached their shields, sending a wave of shock through the command deck. Sparks flew from the walls, and the lights flickered, casting everything in an eerie glow. "Shields at 30%, hull integrity at 65%, shouted Lee, his voice strained with effort. "We can't keep this up much longer." "Hold steady," Carter commanded, gripping the edge of her console. "We're close now, just a little further." The enemy was right behind them, but Carter wasn't worried. She had fought in countless battles, faced overwhelming odds before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future. If humanity could stabilize Solara, it would prove their worth to the galaxy. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the survival of everyone in the galaxy who had no choice but to rely on the light of stars like Solara. As the spearhead finally broke through the radiation storms, the star's core loomed before them, an immense swirling mass of unstable energy. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a chaotic whirlwind of light and matter, constantly shifting and pulsating with an almost sentient malevolence. "This is it," Carter said, her voice steady as she looked at the massive vortex before them. "Initiate conduit deployment." Lieutenant Lee quickly engaged the deployment sequence. The sleek, metallic conduits shot out from the spearhead, their edges glowing with energy as they rocketed toward the heart of the star. They had to hit the core at just the right angle, or the stabilizing process would fail and the star would go supernova. "Conduits are in position," Lee reported, but his voice carried a note of doubt. "We need to keep the fleet off our backs for just a few more seconds." The enemy ships were closing in for the kill, their weapons charging. The spearhead was defenseless, its shields almost completely depleted, its hull battered beyond recognition. Carter knew they wouldn't last much longer. If the conduits didn't stabilize the core soon, the whole fleet and everyone else in the galaxy would be doomed. "We've got one shot," Carter said, her voice low and determined. "This is for all of us." Just as the enemy ships launched their final barrage, a pulse of light erupted from the conduits. The spearhead was caught in the shockwave, tossed like a leaf in the storm, but the conduits had done their job. For a moment, everything went still. Then, a massive shockwave of energy erupted from the star's core, ripping through the surrounding space. The spearhead was thrown back, tumbling through the chaos, but it was alive. The galaxy held its breath as Solara's core stabilized. They had done it, for now. The shockwave from the star's core was like a hammer strike, reverberating through space. The spearhead lurched and twisted as it was flung back by the force. Crew members were thrown from their seats, systems sparked and short-circuited, and the entire ship groaned under the pressure. But despite the chaos, the conduits had done their job. The star's core was no longer in a death spiral, and the destabilization had halted. Carter gritted her teeth, forcing herself to remain focused amid the chaos. Her grip tightened on the armrest as the ship spun wildly. They had only a few moments before they would be swept up in the gravitational pull of the star's outer layers. They had done what seemed impossible, but the mission was far from over. "Status report," Carter barked. "Shields are down to 15%, Captain. Hull integrity at 40%. We're still holding together, but just barely," Lieutenant Lee said, his voice strained. The strain in his eyes told a different story. He was pushing the spearhead to its limits, and the ship was responding with everything it had. "We need to get out of here now," Carter commanded. "Get us away from the core before the gravitational forces tear us apart." Lieutenant Rios, who had been monitoring enemy movements, spoke up urgently. "Captain, the enemy fleet is regrouping. They're preparing to attack again. They're going to try to finish us off while we're vulnerable." Carter's eyes narrowed. She had expected retaliation, but they couldn't afford to fight a protracted battle now. The spearhead was too damaged, and the rest of the fleet was in no condition to provide backup. But they didn't have the luxury of running away either. They had to hold their ground. "Can we get a clear shot at their flagship?" Carter asked, a dangerous glint in her eye. Rios paused, scanning the enemy fleet's formation. "We can try. The spearhead is in no condition for a direct assault, but we might be able to land a few heavy shots if we hit their engines." "Do it," Carter ordered. "Lee, make sure we're moving at full speed. Get us away from the core, but keep enough distance to maintain a firing solution." The spearhead shuddered as its engines roared to life. The ship, battered and bruised, surged forward, pushing itself out of the volatile energy field of Solara's corona. The enemy ships, seemingly undeterred by the shockwave, had already begun closing in. A few moments of tense silence passed as they prepared for the inevitable clash. "Enemy fleet closing fast, Captain," Rhea said, her voice hardening as she keyed in the targeting system. "They're aiming straight for our weak spot. We need to fire now, or we'll be sitting ducks." Carter nodded. "Lee, get us on an intercept course." Rios, fire at will. The spearhead veered sharply to the side as it banked into a turn. The enemy fleet was relentless, each ship a predator, waiting for the kill. But the spearhead, despite its battered condition, wasn't going to make it easy. The weapons array flared to life, and the ship unleashed a barrage of plasma fire aimed directly at the largest enemy vessel, a massive battleship that had been leading the assault. The first volley struck true. The enemy battleship's shields buckled, and a massive explosion erupted from its engine section, causing it to list to the side. "Direct hit. The enemy battleship's crippled," Rios shouted. "They've lost power. They're retreating." "Keep pressing them," Carter ordered, eyes locked on the swirling chaos outside. She could see the remaining enemy ships scattering, attempting to regroup and reform their ranks. Lee's hands were a blur over the console, and the spearhead turned with surgical precision, avoiding enemy fire and striking where it hurt. Despite their weakened state, humanity's will to survive and to finish what they had started fueled the crew's every movement. "Captain," Lee called out, "we've made it out of the core's gravity well. We're clear of Solara, but there's a new problem." Carter looked at him, waiting. "The star's energy is dissipating, but it's not going to be enough," Lee continued. "We've stabilized the core, but the process is too slow. It's still burning out at a dangerous rate. The conduits can't hold it for long. We need to trigger the secondary system, the one that will allow the star to dissipate its remaining energy." Carter frowned. "You mean the backup stabilizers? They're not built for this kind of load." "I know," Lee said, looking grim. "But if we don't deploy them, we'll have a supernova on our hands." There was no choice. Carter's mind raced as the weight of the situation settled in. They had bought themselves time, but time wasn't enough. They needed to make sure the star's final collapse didn't destroy everything in its wake. "Deploy the backup system," she ordered. "Let's finish what we started." The spearhead drifted at the edge of Solara's dying influence, its hull groaning with every movement as it swam in the turbulence of the unstable star. The crew was exhausted, their faces etched with fatigue, but the mission was far from over. Humanity had stabilized the core, but the real challenge lay ahead, triggering the secondary system to disperse Solara's remaining volatile energy without igniting a supernova. "Captain," Lee said, his voice grim, "we're running on fumes. The backup stabilizers weren't designed to handle this scale of instability. If we trigger them now, there's a chance they'll overload. We could lose everything." Carter stared at the data streaming across her console, the red warnings flashing in front of her. She knew the odds. It was a gamble, one that no one could afford to lose. The fate of the galaxy, not just humanity, was hanging in the balance. "What's the alternative?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the decision. "If we don't trigger the stabilizers, we risk the entire system going critical. That would send a shockwave that could destroy everything in its path. A supernova this close to inhabited space would wipe out entire star systems." Lee looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and resolve in his eyes. "Then we don't have a choice." "Exactly," Carter said. She turned to Rios, who was monitoring the enemy fleet's movements. "Any sign of enemy reinforcements?" "None yet," Rios replied. "They've pulled back for the moment, but it's only a matter of time before they regroup. We're sitting ducks out here." Carter nodded, her mind already calculating their next moves. "We don't have time to wait. Lee, initiate the backup stabilizer sequence." Captain," Lee responded, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. His hands moved swiftly, his fingers dancing over the console as he activated the sequence. The spearhead began to hum as the stabilizers powered up, their systems clicking into place. The ship shuddered, and the surrounding space seemed to ripple with the force of Solara's unstable energy, stretching the limits of the spearhead's shield generators. For a moment, everything seemed to hold, but then the pulse of energy from the star's core surged again, and the ship's systems groaned under the strain. "Stabilizers are online, Captain, but they're pulling too much power," Lee reported, his voice strained. "We're overloading the reactor. The ship can't handle this much strain." "Can we reroute the power?" Carter asked, her mind racing. "Rerouting, but it's not enough," Lee said, tapping furiously at his console. "We'll need to jettison our auxiliary power to give the stabilizers the juice they need. We'll be left with minimal shields and life support, but that might buy us just enough time to stabilize the star." Carter weighed the options. If they went forward with the power dump, the spearhead would become vulnerable. Without shields, the ship would be an easy target for any incoming fire, but without it, they'd never have the power to keep the stabilizers running long enough. "Do it," Carter said, her voice resolute. "Jettison auxiliary power and maintain the stabilizers at all costs. We need to give Solura a chance to burn out properly. Lee nodded grimly and began the procedure. As the auxiliary systems were ejected into space, the spearhead shuddered again, the energy flow stabilizing for the moment. The lights on the ship dimmed, casting long shadows over the crew's faces. Life support systems began to whine under the strain, but for now, the ship was holding together. But as they focused on the star, they saw a new danger emerging. "Captain," Rios shouted, "the enemy fleet is regrouping. They're launching a final assault. They're coming straight for us." "Of course they are," Carter muttered. She gripped the edge of her seat, eyes locked on the horizon. "How much time do we have before the backup stabilizers give out?" "Less than 10 minutes, Lee said. "The ship can't handle much more. If we don't hold them off now, the stabilizers won't be able to finish the job. The star will collapse." Carter's mind raced. The stakes had never been higher. They had only moments to finish the mission, and now they had to fend off a final desperate enemy assault. "Rios, prepare for battle," Carter commanded. "Lee, keep those stabilizers running as long as you can. I'll buy us time." The crew sprang into action. Rios shifted into her tactical role, the targeting systems locking onto the approaching enemy ships, while Lee kept his focus on the delicate operation unfolding within the spearhead's reactor. Carter gripped the command console, her mind clear and focused. The odds were overwhelming, but humanity had faced worse odds before. They had fought wars, survived invasions, and conquered the impossible. This time, they would survive, no matter the cost. "We hold this line," Carter said, her voice steely. "We finish what we started, for humanity, for the galaxy." And as the enemy fleet closed in, the final battle for the fate of Solara, and perhaps the entire galaxy, began. The tension in the command deck was palpable as the spearhead drifted in the vast emptiness of space, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound that broke the eerie silence. Carter's grip tightened on the console as she watched the enemy fleet rapidly closing in. Their numbers were overwhelming, but the fate of Solara and countless other star systems hung in the balance. "Enemy fleet incoming," Rios reported, her voice taut with urgency. "They're coming in fast. It looks like they've refocused on us." "We don't have time for this," Carter muttered under her breath. She turned her attention to Lee. "How are the stabilizers holding up?" Lee's face was pale, his brow glistening with sweat as his fingers danced over the console, working to keep the backup stabilizers functional. "We're barely holding on, Captain. The auxiliary power is running low, and the stabilizers are drawing more energy than we can afford. If we don't complete this in the next 5 minutes, the star will collapse, and everything we've done will be for nothing." "5 minutes," Carter repeated grimly. "We don't have 5 minutes. Get us a clear shot at their flagship, Rios." Rios analyzed the approaching fleet, her eyes flicking back and forth between the various readings. "Their flagship is in the center, protected by a shield wall of destroyers and frigates. It's heavily armored. But if we can knock out their outer defenses, we might get a shot at the bridge. That's our only option. Lock onto the destroyers and take them out," Carter ordered, her voice resolute. "We're going to need to make every shot count." Rios nodded, her hands flying across the tactical panel as the targeting systems locked onto the enemy fleet. "Locked on. Firing in 3, 2, 1. The spearhead shuddered as its primary weapon system unleashed a barrage of concentrated plasma fire. The blasts tore through the outer ranks of the enemy fleet, sending explosions rippling outward as the destroyer shields buckled and collapsed under the intensity. One by one, enemy ships detonated in fiery brilliance, but the flagship remained well guarded in the heart of the formation. "We've breached their outer defenses," Rios reported, her tone fierce. "Their shields are down. We can hit the flagship now." "Do it," Carter commanded, already turning to Lee. "How much longer until those stabilizers can finish?" 3 minutes, Captain, but I can't guarantee it will be enough. The star is fluctuating wildly. We need to keep our fire on the enemy to buy us more time. Carter's mind raced. There was no way they could afford to let up. She turned back to the view screen, her eyes steely as she surveyed the battlefield. The enemy flagship, despite its shields being down, had begun to reposition itself, attempting to regroup. The remaining enemy ships were trying to form a defensive perimeter around it. Rios, aim for their engines. We cripple their mobility, we cripple their ability to fight back. Rios didn't hesitate. Understood. Firing now. The spearhead lurched again as another wave of plasma fire erupted from its weapon systems, the shots streaking across the void toward the enemy flagship. The first strike hit its port side, rupturing the outer hull. A second shot landed directly in the engine compartment, and a massive explosion rocked the flagship. The shockwave sent smaller vessels flying as the mighty warship was thrown off course, its engines barely functioning. They've lost power, Rios shouted. The flagship is adrift. They're vulnerable. Take them out now, Carter barked. The crew watched as the spearhead fired again, the plasma bolts tearing through the enemy flagship's weakened hull. The flagship's remaining defenses crumbled, and a final devastating explosion marked its destruction. For a brief moment, silence filled the command deck as the reality of their victory began to settle in. But Carter knew it wasn't over yet. The remaining enemy ships, now leaderless and disorganized, were still dangerous, and time was running out for the star. Lee, what's the status on the stabilizers? Carter asked, not taking her eyes off the remaining enemy forces. 2 minutes left, Lee said, voice tight with the strain of his work. I'm doing everything I can, but if the enemy fires on us now, we're done for. Rios turned her attention to the remaining ships. They're regrouping, but they're not organized. They're confused without their flagship. Carter's heart pounded in her chest. They had taken down the heart of the enemy fleet, but there were still dozens of ships left, and they would be back for revenge. They needed to finish this now. They needed to hold out long enough for the stabilizers to stabilize Solara. Rios, keep firing. Don't let them close the distance. Lee, keep those stabilizers running. This is it. The battle intensified. The spearhead fired once more, its weapons tearing into the remaining ships. The enemy tried to retaliate, but their shots were weaker, disorganized. The spearhead moved with deadly precision, each strike eliminating another enemy vessel. Carter clenched her fists, her gaze locked on the view screen. The remaining enemy ships were scattering, trying to escape the wrath of humanity's final defense. But the true threat remained the dying star itself. The stabilizers had to finish their work. As the last enemy ship retreated, Carter turned to Lee. How much longer? 30 seconds, he said, his voice ragged. I think it's going to work. The crew held their breath. The countdown ticked down. And then a brilliant flash of light erupted across the star system as Solara's core stabilized for the final time. The energy release was controlled, a perfect burn that safely dissipated the star's energy. The shockwave that had threatened to devastate everything in its path was contained. Humanity had won. The spearhead remained in the silent aftermath, the crew battered but alive, their mission accomplished. They had saved not only Solara, but countless other worlds from destruction. But Carter knew this was only one battle in the ongoing war. For now they had won, but the fight for survival was far from over. The spearhead hovered in the wake of the battle, its hull scared, its systems strained to their limits. The immediate threat was over, but the tension on the bridge remained palpable. The crew had fought hard, against impossible odds, and now they faced the somber reality of their victory. Solara, the dying star, had been saved, yet the battle was only part of the story. The war was far from finished. Carter stood in front of the viewport, staring out into the vastness of space. Solara now burned steadily, no longer on the brink of collapse. The shockwave had been contained, and the threat of a supernova had passed. But the galaxy had been irrevocably changed. The enemy, though crippled, was not defeated. Their fleet had retreated, but there was no doubt they would regroup and strike again. This time, they would be more prepared. "We did it," Captain Rhea said, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We stopped the supernova. Solara's safe, but I don't think they're giving up that easily." Carter nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant star. "I know, this was just one battle, Rios. The enemy will be back, and next time, they'll come with everything they have." Lee, who had been silent for the past few minutes, stepped forward from the operations console. His face was pale, the strain of the last few hours evident in every line. "The stabilizers worked, Captain, but we're barely holding together. The systems are running at minimal capacity. We need repairs, and we need them fast." "We'll get them," Carter replied. "But first, we need to deal with the aftermath. The enemy's retreat isn't permanent. They'll come back stronger next time. We need to be ready." Rios shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she turned to Carter. "What do you suggest, Captain? We can't stay here for long. We're sitting targets with the ship in this condition." Carter's jaw clenched. The spearhead was a symbol of humanity's defiance, but even the most advanced ship could only survive so much before the damage became irreparable. They couldn't afford to stay in the same system long enough to be picked off by another wave of enemies. "We need to rendezvous with the fleet. We've got to regroup, resupply, and prepare for the next move." "Where?" Lee asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Our fleet's scattered. We don't know where the enemy's going to strike next." "I know," Carter said, turning to face the crew, "but we can't stay here. Solara's safe, but we've got more pressing matters to deal with. If we don't move now, we risk being caught off guard. Our best option is to link up with the Vanguard fleet. They're stationed at the edge of the Nexus. It's a bit of a risk, but we're not going to find a better spot to regroup." "The Vanguard fleet," Rios echoed thoughtfully. "They're one of the few remaining fleets that haven't been completely overwhelmed by the enemy. They might have the resources we need." "Exactly," Carter said. "We've got to push through. We'll send out a distress signal, reroute our energy, and try to make it to the Nexus. The Vanguard's our best shot at keeping the enemy from gaining ground, but we have to move now. No more waiting." There was a brief silence as the crew processed Carter's orders. Finally, Lee spoke up, his voice steady despite the weight of their situation. "Aye, Captain. I'll get the navigation systems back online. We'll head for the Nexus." Carter turned to Rios. "You and Lee hold down the fort. I'll need you both sharp and ready for anything. This isn't over." Rios gave a curt nod. "We're with you, Captain." The atmosphere in the command deck shifted. The reality of the battle had settled into the crew's bones, but they knew they couldn't stop. They were humanity's last line of defense. They'd seen how close they'd come to losing everything, and now they were faced with the grim task of preparing for whatever came next. As Carter turned back to the viewport, the image of the steady, glowing Solara lingered in her mind. It was a reminder of their success, but also of the fragility of their victory. Humanity had held back the darkness, but the galaxy was far from safe. The spearhead had bought them time, but what they did next would determine whether that time would matter. "Prepare for jump," Carter said, her voice firm. "We're heading to the Nexus. It's time to take the fight to them. We're not just fighting for Solara anymore. We're fighting for the whole damn galaxy." And with that, the spearhead began to shift course, moving away from the dying star and into the unknown. Their mission wasn't over. The final confrontation was still ahead of them, and they would face it head-on, no matter the cost. For humanity, for the galaxy, they would fight until the very end. The spearhead hummed as it cut through the vast emptiness of space, heading toward the Nexus, the rendezvous point with the Vanguard fleet. The journey was long, the ship's damaged systems struggling to maintain full functionality. But the crew pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. Solara's survival had been a victory, but the galaxy was still in the enemy's grip. The real battle was yet to come. Carter stood at the command console, her gaze fixed on the display in front of her. The damage to the ship was severe, but it was still operational. She could feel the weight of every decision, every moment of their journey, bearing down on her. Time was running out. The enemy would regroup, and when they did, they would strike with everything they had. Humanity needed a plan, a decisive one. "We've got incoming transmissions from the Vanguard fleet," Rios reported, her voice a welcome sound amid the tense quiet. "They're expecting us, but they've got their own problems. They've been scattered and weakened after the last few engagements." Carter nodded, her jaw tight. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. Prepare for communications. I need to speak with Admiral O'Reilly." Lee, still working on the damaged systems, glanced up. "Captain, the navigation's holding steady. We'll reach the Nexus in just under an hour. But after that, I'm not sure how long we'll last if we don't get these repairs done." "We'll make do," Carter said, her voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion she could feel creeping into her bones. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. The Vanguard needs us now more than ever." A few minutes later, the comm channel opened, and the grizzled face of Admiral O'Reilly appeared on the main screen. His expression was grim, his uniform bearing the marks of battle. Despite the fatigue in his eyes, there was a fire that still burned within him. "Captain Carter," O'Reilly said, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles. "I'm glad to see you're still standing. We've been holding the line, but it's getting harder. The enemy is massing on the outer rim, and we're running out of time." "We're on our way, Admiral," Carter replied, her tone firm. "We've been through hell, but we're still here. We've got a plan, and we need to act fast. Solara's safe, but this war isn't over." O'Reilly nodded. "I agree. We've gathered intel on the enemy's new strategies, but they've adapted quickly. They've been using our weaknesses against us. And worse, we've detected a massive fleet gathering near the Nexus. They're getting ready for a full-scale assault. Then it's time we strike first," Carter said, her resolve hardening. "We can't afford to wait any longer. Let's hit them while we still have the element of surprise." The Admiral's eyes sharpened. "You're right. The longer we delay, the more prepared they become. I'll mobilize the fleet. Meet us at the coordinates I've sent you. We'll regroup, rearm, and hit them with everything we've got." Carter's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "We'll be there. Don't worry, Admiral. The spearhead is coming in hot, and we're bringing the fight to them." The comm link cut, and Carter turned to face her crew. They were ready. Their eyes, though weary, were filled with determination. They had made it this far, and now they had a real chance to end the war. "Rios, get our weapon systems online," Carter ordered. "Lee, push the engines to full power. We need to be ready for anything. We're going to take the fight to the enemy, and we're not coming back without a victory." Lee nodded, his face grim. "Understood, Captain. We'll make it happen." "Rios," Carter said, her voice quiet but intense, "you've got this. You're our eyes and ears. We need you on point when we arrive." Rios gave a determined nod. "You can count on me, Captain. We're going to hit them hard." The spearhead surged forward, its engines firing with renewed energy, and the crew settled into their roles. They were battered, exhausted, and running on fumes, but they had something far more powerful: hope. Hope that their sacrifice had meaning. Hope that their determination would carry them through the storm. As they neared the Vanguard fleet's position, Carter could see the immense size of the enemy armada looming in the distance. It was unlike anything they had faced before, dozens of massive warships, each one more formidable than the last. But the spearhead had always been humanity's answer to impossible odds. "All systems are go, Captain," Lee reported. "We're ready for combat." Carter's heart beat faster as the final confrontation loomed ahead. The battle would be fierce, but humanity's will was unbreakable. They had fought against the odds before. They would do it again. "Let's do this," Carter said, her voice ringing with certainty. For Solara, for Earth, for the future of the galaxy, we fight for everything. With a final glance at the crew, she turned to face the vast fleet ahead. The battle for the galaxy's future had begun, and humanity would not go down without a fight.